When my partner and I decided to leave the chaos of city life behind, we thought we were making the best decision of our lives. A fresh start, a quiet place to call our own, and enough space to breathe. We found an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio. It was affordable, almost suspiciously so, but we attributed the low price to its age and location, miles away from any bustling town center. The property came with a barn. At first glance, it seemed charming, like something out of a vintage postcard. It stood tall at the edge of the field, weathered but sturdy, with faded red paint peeling from its wooden planks. I remember joking with my partner that we'd finally have a place to store all the junk we'd accumulated over the years. It wasn't until we started talking to the locals that the barn became unsettling. When we'd mention the property, their faces would shift, tightened smiles, nervous glances. Most of them would quickly change the subject or offer vague warnings like, "That barn's been there longer than it should be," or "Don't spend too much time near it." One older man at the general store muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch, but his tone sent a chill up my spine. Of course, we brushed it all off. Small towns always have their fair share of ghost stories, right? I figured the barn was just a relic of some local folklore, the kind of thing that parents use to scare their kids into behaving. Besides, it wasn't like we were superstitious. We had moved here to escape the noise and stress of city life, not to get tangled up in some rural mystery. Still, there was something about the barn that unsettled me. It was hard to explain, but every time I glanced at it from the kitchen window, I felt a strange heaviness settle in my chest. The barn seemed to loom, even in the bright light of day, like it was watching us, or waiting. My partner dismissed my unease, calling it big move jitters. I tried to laugh it off too, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone on this property. The first few nights in the farmhouse were quiet, almost too quiet. I remember lying in bed, listening to the wind rustling through the trees outside, and realizing just how unnerving true silence can be. There were no cars, no sirens, no distant hum of life, just the occasional creak of the house settling and the steady ticking of the old clock in the hallway. But it wasn't long before the silence was broken. At first, it was small things, things that could easily be explained away. The barn door creaking open in the middle of the night, even though we were sure we'd locked it. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel outside, only for us to find nothing when we looked. Our dog, Max, usually the bravest and friendliest dog you could imagine, began refusing to go near the barn. He'd stop dead in his tracks if we tried to walk him in that direction, his ears pinned back, a low growl rumbling in his throat. It was so unlike him that it left us both unnerved. One evening, while I was unpacking boxes in the living room, I heard it for the first time, a faint sound, almost like whispering, coming from the direction of the barn. I froze, holding my breath to make sure I wasn't imagining it. It was barely audible, like someone murmuring just on the edge of my hearing. I stepped out onto the porch, peering into the darkness. The barn stood there, silent and still, bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight. I shook my head and laughed nervously to myself, convincing myself it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. Every time I walked past the barn during the day, I'd feel it, that weight in my chest, like something pressing down on me. The air around it always felt colder than the rest of the property, even on sunny days. And then there were the shadows. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch movement, just a flicker, like someone darting behind the barn or slipping through the partially open door. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that the stress of the move and adjusting to a new life was making me paranoid. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right about that barn, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to demand my attention. It was after a particularly restless night that I decided I needed answers. The noises, the shadows, the whispers, they were becoming impossible to ignore. My partner still thought I was being paranoid, so I didn't bother mentioning my plan. Instead, I drove into town the next morning, determined to learn whatever I could about the property and that damned barn. At first, the locals weren't very forthcoming. When I asked about the barn, most of them avoided my eyes, mumbling vague comments like, It's best to leave old stories buried, or that place carries bad memories. But one woman at the library, an older lady with kind eyes, finally relented after some coaxing. She glanced around as though making sure no one else could hear us, and then lowered her voice. "You bought the old Miller property, didn't you?" she asked, her tone heavy with unease. When I nodded, she let out a slow sigh. "That barn you're so curious about, it's the last one standing." I frowned, unsure what she meant. She pulled out an old, dusty book from the shelf behind her and opened it to a page marked with a yellowing newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Wealthy Farmer. Family Massacre Shocks Community." The woman explained that the barn had once belonged to a farmer named Samuel Miller. He was a wealthy man, known for his vast acres of farmland and his peculiar tradition of building a barn every time his wife gave birth to a child. 6 barns stood proudly on his property, each one a symbol of his growing family. But everything fell apart when his wife became pregnant with their 7th child. The birth didn't go as planned. Both the mother and child died during labor, leaving Samuel heartbroken and spiraling into despair. His grief quickly turned to madness. As debts mounted and his fortune crumbled, he did the unthinkable. One night, Samuel took a hatchet and murdered each of his 6 children, burying their bodies beneath their respective barns. Finally, he went to the 7th barn, the one meant for the child he never got to hold, and hanged himself from the rafters. "Some say his ghost still lingers there," the woman whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They say he's searching for something, or someone, and those who get too close." She didn't finish her sentence, but the haunted look in her eyes said enough. I left the library that day with the book tucked under my arm, my hands shaking, the weight of what I had learned pressed heavily on me. I couldn't shake the image of the farmer, his anguished spirit pacing the barn, surrounded by the restless souls of his children. And suddenly, all the strange occurrences on our property, the whispers, the shadows, the cold spots, felt horrifyingly real. That night, I sat by the window, staring at the barn in the moonlight. It stood there, silent and imposing, as though daring me to come closer. For the first time, I wondered if moving here had been a mistake. The night after I uncovered the story, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself it was just a story, an old folktale exaggerated by the locals over time. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right about that barn, and whatever it wasn't just folklore. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by Max growling at the bedroom window. His hackles were raised, his teeth bared, a sound so guttural it made my stomach drop. I quickly sat up, my heart pounding as I peered out the window. The barn was bathed in moonlight, the fields eerily still. But then I saw it movement. The barn door, which we always kept shut, was wide open, swaying gently in the breeze. At first, I thought it might have been the wind or a stray animal. But then, a shadow crossed the threshold, long and thin, moving with a deliberate slowness that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the shape of an animal, or anything I could recognize. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it slip into the barn, disappearing into the darkness. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. My partner stayed asleep, oblivious, and Max refused to follow me, whimpering as I stepped out into the cool night air. Each step toward the barn felt heavier than the last, like something was pulling me back, warning me not to go any closer. But I couldn't stop. I had to know what was inside. As I approached the barn, the air grew colder. My breath formed clouds in front of me, and the faint smell of damp earth and decay filled my nose. The barn door creaked louder as I pushed it open, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the pitch-black interior. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses on your ears and makes your heart pound louder in your chest. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. It echoed faintly off the wooden walls, but there was no response. The flashlight beam swept across the barn, illuminating old farming tools, cobwebs, and piles of hay. And then, it landed on something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the barn, just beneath the rafters, hung a rope, a noose, swaying gently as though someone had just stepped off it. The beam of light trembled in my hand as I stared at it, unable to look away. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if the barn itself was closing in on me. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, but it wasn't. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a low, mournful sound that grew louder with each passing second. "Where are they?" the voice whispered, full of sorrow and something darker, something angry. The flashlight flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. My hand shook as I backed toward the door, but before I could make it out, the barn fell silent. I froze, my heart racing as I strained to hear anything, any movement, any sign of life. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, standing in the shadows, barely illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight, was a figure, tall and gaunt, his face shrouded in darkness, his outline unmistakably human. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was suffocating. My chest tightened as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. This wasn't just a ghost. This was something far worse. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, rooted to the spot as the figure stood there, motionless in the dark corner of the barn. My flashlight flickered again, threatening to plunge me into complete darkness. But even in the dim light, I could feel his gaze, or whatever presence he had, bearing down on me. Then he stepped forward, just one slow, deliberate step. The faint creak of the floorboard under his weight sent a chill up my spine. His face remained obscured, but now I could see more of him. His tattered, dirt-streaked clothes, his unnaturally long fingers, and the faint outline of the noose still hanging around his neck. "Why are you here?" The voice was different this time, low and guttural, as though it wasn't meant to be spoken by human lips. The question hung in the air, thick with malice and despair. I couldn't answer. My throat was dry, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I didn't have to. The barn itself seemed to shudder, as if some unseen force was building inside it. The walls creaked, the rafters groaned, and that awful smell of decay grew stronger. My flashlight flickered again, and in its brief strobe-like flashes, I saw them, other shadows, smaller and fainter, moving in the periphery. Children, 6 of them, their forms translucent and warped, their faces pale and expressionless. They didn't speak, but their presence filled the barn with an overwhelming sorrow. They stood behind the figure as though bound to him, their hollow eyes fixed on me. It was too much. My legs finally obeyed me, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure stepped forward again, and this time, his head tilted slightly, as if in curiosity or warning. "Leave," he growled, the word reverberating through the barn like a thunderclap. The children's forms wavered, their expressions twisting into something closer to fear. Even they seemed afraid of him. I turned and bolted out of the barn, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The air outside felt thick, almost suffocating, and every step back toward the house felt like I was running through water. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. Max was barking furiously at the window, his nose pressed to the glass as if he could sense what I had just encountered. My partner woke up, startled, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I? What words could I possibly use to describe the horror I had just seen? That night, I stayed up, sitting by the window and watching the barn from a distance. It was quiet now, still and unassuming, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. The figure's warning echoed in my mind. Leave. And for the first time since moving here, I realized that staying might not be an option. Whatever haunted that barn, it wasn't just a tragic spirit or a lingering echo of the past. It was something far darker, something that didn't want us there. And I was starting to think we should listen.